I think that most of us are in a trance before something typically happens that jolts us out of that. And we think, oh, wait, why am I doing this?
Right.
That's not me. That's what I saw fulanita or like mommy do, you know?
Yeah.
But that's not me. Let me really think about what my preferences are.
Sure.
You know, and so it's really kind of getting out of that trance and awakening and developing that awareness that really gets us closest to our highest self, right? Like our true selves.
What up? It's Dramos, and this is the recap. Of course, as I do each and every week, breaking down some of the biggest headlines from this last week. My guest this week, helping me break it all down, is a therapist and bruja. She goes by the name of Josie Rosario, and she'll be hopping on in just a little bit. Before that, though, man, let's get into some of the BS from this last week. Now, listen, I'll admit this story hits particularly close to home for me, as I come from a household where both my mother and my sister were teachers. And I feel for, any teacher out there on a normal day. But my empathy is even further extended during these times where the Omicron variant is just tearing through communities. And it's becoming very obvious that the people in power just don't seem to give a damn. I mean, listen, let's look at the city of Chicago, for example, right? Where teachers had to refuse to show up to work for 5 days as a protest for the lack of COVID safety precautions that were being taken in the city schools. And after, those 5 days where the city fought with them tooth and nail on their demands, the city eventually decided, okay, we'll give them something to get them back to work, right? And what was that something? Had to be something crazy and outlandish, right? Like, why would the city be fighting so hard against the teacher's request if it wasn't something crazy and outlandish? Well, that's a great question. And let's actually look at what was the something that the teachers were okay with. The city agreed to give the schools KN95 masks for both students and staff for the remainder of the school year. They've also made the availability of weekly COVID testing happen, and parameters for when a school could switch to remote teaching have been put in place. So let's kind of break this down a little bit. Teachers literally had to stop coming to work for 5 days just so the city would agree to give them some masks, proper COVID testing, and have a plan in place when things hit the fan? Huh? Now listen, maybe it's just Chicago that's bugging, right? Like, let's go to another major city, let's say New York, right? For example, the city that never sleeps. I mean, they surely have to have their stuff together, right? Wrong. This last week, thousands of students in New York walked out of class protesting what they said were unsafe conditions as the Omicron variant continues to cause roughly 40,000 new COVID cases daily in New York City. Now, state legislators, they've been doing their job, right? They've been pleading with New York Mayor Eric Adams to pivot to remote learning until the surge of this variant is under control. And you know what that fool said, the mayor of New York City, Eric Adams? His response was, he's going to need about 6 months before the city can provide a virtual option. 6 months? He does realize that this last week, total hospitalizations topped 12,000 in New York for the first time since April 28th of 2020. Like, he does realize that, right? And to be fair, though, I'm also going to go on the side of optimism here. To be fair, daily COVID cases and hospitalizations do appear to be slowing down, right? But the point still does remain. Even with that in consideration, the people put in place to protect us, and that includes the CDC. They can't get away, scot-free here either. I mean, they are having their ever-changing recommendations, right? They take some responsibility in this as well. But the people put in place, including the CDC, to protect us, right? The people put in place to protect us. They would rather spit in our faces and tell us it's rain than actually do their jobs and keep us safe. Shame, shame, shame. What a time to be alive, y'all. Now, with that said, let's bring on my guest for this week to help me break down some of these other headlines. Let's do it from her professional lens, if you will. My guest this week is a licensed therapist, coach, entrepreneur, and bruja, Josie Rosario. How you feeling?
I'm good. I'm so excited to be chatting with you today.
I appreciate that. I mean, listen, you're doing a lot of incredible work. I've been following you from afar. So I want to get into all that. But first, if it's cool with you, I kind of want to get your take from your professional perspective on a few things we've been seeing in the news like this last week or so.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so I mean, let's kind of start in the world of politics, because it seems like there may be a lot of mental health issues going on in the world and the people who are existing in those spaces. You have this idea of voter suppression happening from the Republicans trying to keep people from voting, especially in battleground states like Georgia. And Biden has finally come out and gone hard about it, publicly fighting against it. And it kind of it all kind of stems to like this inherent need for power, right? I feel like if you really broke down what's happening, what we're seeing, it is people really desperately valuing power over humanity. And valuing, power over this country as a whole. And it's obvious that we're incredibly divided during these times. And I talk to my father about this all the time, because he's one of these people who gets incredibly frustrated and just writes off anybody who is essentially agreeing with what we're seeing with things like this voter suppression. But I know you speak of empathy a lot in your content. And I think that it's important for people to sort of recognize that while we may disagree with these people, while they obviously have some really toxic ideas, a lot of their belief systems and their sort of ability to be swayed by, certain media outlets definitely comes from a certain place. So I'm curious for you, I mean, how do we kind of mend this? Because I don't think as a country we can keep going down this path where we're all just screaming at each other. So how do we have these kind of conversations with people who have, these belief systems that seem so incredibly different and just divisive?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, I think we've been having these conversations for a couple of years now, right?
Sure.
When folks have been just a lot more open to, or not even open, but folks have been awakened to what other people are really thinking and, how, what people really believe. And right. I think that a couple of things kind of need to happen. I think that when we are going to engage in a conversation with folks who might have, opinions that are different than ours, I think that it's really important to be aware of like our own resources and our own capacity. It can be very easy to, get caught up, right? Get caught up in arguments, think about the holidays or, think about the, when Trump was still in office, I mean, friendships, relationships ended over, who folks voted for. And so I think it's really important, to just make sure that you are aware of your own resources and that if you're making the decision to interact with someone who might have different beliefs or opinions than you, that you're prepared. You don't have to do anything.
Sure.
Right? That is a form of self-care, right? Making, walking away from a conversation or just saying, I don't have it today. Right. When it, if you do have it, right, and you do want to have those conversations with folks, you have to be honest and know that you can't change people, right? People are going to believe what they want to believe, and they are entitled to that, right? If you really are coming from a place where you want to understand, really truly want to understand, that means that you have to be willing to listen. That means that your views and maybe a little bit of your ego kind of needs to be placed on a shelf for a little bit, so that you can really open and really, learn and really understand. I think that if there's anything, I mean, there've been a lot of things that this political divide has taught us is that, we have really differing beliefs, and a lot of we don't know our neighbors. We don't. Right. And so I think that coming from a really awake and aware place of I actually do want to know my neighbor, I don't want to know my neighbor, can really be helpful in having the conversation if you actually want to have the conversation. Right.
No, I think that's definitely a really great point. And I think, speaking to what you kind of said about being able to choose to have the conversation or not, I think, unfortunately, also when it comes to technology, there's a lot of choices that we're not able to make because we have so much stuff in our face these days, right? And even, when we talk about just like, I look at last week, that fire that happened in the Bronx, right? I know you're from New York. I mean, those kind of things just hit harder. where 17 people died, 8 of which were children. This is like just truly devastating. And you can't help but have some of that just kind of, carry on with your day when you read about it. It carries onto your body almost when you hear about stories like this. I mean, how do we kind of exist in this hyper world where we can, hyper connected world, I should say? How do we protect our mental health, but also find the balance of still kind of staying informed, and not being overtaken by it, but also not being ignorant to all that's going on around us?
Absolutely. I mean, that's such an important question. I think that this is the beauty of having options, right? That, it can be a double-edged sword, right? That we have so many different news outlets and so many different ways that we get information, but that also means that we have multiple opportunities to tune it off. And so I think boundaries here is, we talk about boundaries. We've been talking about boundaries a lot these past couple years, but when it comes to social media, when it comes to just like news, you have to be really really clear rather about what your boundaries are or what your parameters are. And I know that a lot of times, we think about boundaries as like, no, it's a wall, it's like a limit. And I think of boundaries as what conditions need to exist for yes. What conditions need to exist for me to be able to consume news, right? Sure. Is that just the CNN alert? Is that, I am going to, lean on my peer group so that I can hold myself accountable, right? We can turn these things off. And because there's this addictive quality to social media in particular, I get that sometimes we're going to need that support. So, it's also on us, right? Taking personal accountability to get that support. So that, to your point, we're not oblivious, right? We don't live in a vacuum, but that we're also, being mindful about those parameters, about those conditions that need to exist for you to actually consume news.
No, I love that. Yeah, I mean, boundaries are obviously more than just like a popular keyword these days or buzzword. They're so incredibly important. You begin to realize that as an adult that you don't have to do everything. You don't have to consume everything or have to talk to everybody. You have choices within, this life and how you want to live it. Now, we've talked a lot about some negative things. Let's kind of move on to some good news that's been happening where you had Maya Angelou as the first Black woman who will ever appear on a quarter. And then you also have Native American activist Wilma Mankiller, who's going to follow that. I want to kind of talk about mentally why something like this, why representation like this on such a grand scale is so important for people to see. I mean, even particularly when you talk about this next generation of younger kids coming up, why are things like this so important? I'm sure there's a lot of people who just don't understand why this is such a big deal for people of color, but let's kind of talk about mentally why things like this make a difference.
Yeah. So, right, our subconscious needs to see it to believe it, right? That's why you've probably seen like that Steve Harvey clip around like, sitting in first class, right? Yeah. That your mind then starts to want to, recreate that experience. And so it's very similar in that, if I see someone who looks like me, right, I identify as a Black Dominican-American woman. If I see someone who looks like me with features like mine, and I see them being represented in this very ubiquitous and this very like grand, big way, then that says something about me. That says something good about me. And why that's really important for those of us who are marginalized or have marginalized identities is because we live in a society that is organized around race, right? And white is superior, everything else is inferior. And so whether, no one has to tell you that for you to know that. Kids know that, right? So many studies kind of show this. And so, if we are already born into this society, and this is a global situation, right? Like this is a global thing. This is not just in the US, but if we are born and getting these indirect and direct messages that we are inferior, less than, and then we see ourselves represented in this way, then it does something, when it comes to like the neuroscience of it, like, our brains can shift and change. And so it changes, right, what we believe about ourselves, and not just that, but what we're capable of, and so I know that it can be hard to kind of put to words like why representation matters, but it says that, we're here. Yeah.
Right.
You know, we have been pushed to the margins, but we are here. We're here to stay. What we say matters. What we bring to the table matters. You know, we're not really inferior.
Sure. No, I love that. I think that's beautifully worded. I love the little science thrown in there as well, you know, and I think you have a way with words and a way of putting things. So I want to get to some of the content that you put out there, specifically 2 things that I pulled from your Instagram page that I thought were really powerful, kind of messages and also just ideas that you were contemplating on. And the first one was, you said, what you learned about love in your family has everything to do with how you relate to your friends and partners. And this is something I personally have just begun to unpack. I went away to a retreat where the Hoffman process, where they believe everything reverts back to, you know, your childhood, essentially what you saw as a kid. And they talk about just as early as like 18 months old, you begin to pick up patterns from your parents. And that your interactions throughout the course of your life are a lot of times dictated by the things that you saw as a kid. So let's kind of unpack that a little bit from your perspective. Like for anybody who's not, you know, well-versed in that, like, and they don't necessarily have the self-awareness to see this, how, you know, does your things, you know, the way you learn about love at such a young age really impact you as an adult right now?
Yeah, it's almost like, you know, you come up with a template, right? And so what you see, and even before we, you know, there's a field of epigenetics, right? Where there are, right, like some of us have markers, you know, in our DNA, especially around trauma, right? That even before we are, you know, on this side, we already kind of, you know, have certain experiences within us. And so that's like one piece, right? Which is just so important and so fascinating. But, you know, when we are babies, when we are young, we are, you know, we're just, when people say that we're sponges, right? When we're kids, like that's true. Right. And so what we see is precisely, you know, kind of the template that we end up, you know, we grow up with until, you know, we individuate and we become adults and, you know, self-awareness and our brain fully develops and all of the things. And so the thing is that a lot of these things happen unconsciously, right? If you see that the way that your mom, for example, is rewarded, that's, you know, my word, rewarded, you know, with like love and affection and maybe even financially, right, is by serving your father, for example, or tending to, you know, these like very stereotypical roles, then it is not unreasonable for you to think that that is how you get love, right? And then you add, right, because again, we don't live in a vacuum. I'm a systemic relational therapist. So I see everything from a systemic point of view. Then you add, you know, your identities, you add your experience in school, which is over some of our time. You add your experience at work, right? And these are constantly being reinforced. Then you think that this is just the way that it is, but it all started at home, you know? And so that's why it's so important, you know, that we do build the self-awareness of why we do what we do, because we're not born doing those things. We pick that up somewhere. And being that we are human beings, we are hardwired for connection. We're hardwired to be in a unit. Our first unit is our family. So it is not too wild to think that that's where we kind of get our templates from.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's beautifully said. And last thing, I want to be respectful of your time. So, I mean, last thing, if it's okay with you, I want to touch on, you talked about this idea of the inner child, right? And I love this thing because I feel like I was somebody who neglected my inner child for so long, just on this idea of like building success and trying to build up my career, right? And also the way you worded it, though. So you say your inner child might be having a field day on Black Friday and you don't even know it. And that's profound on so many levels, aside from just the inner child part. But also, I kind of feel like oftentimes in our community, we find ourselves chasing that really short-term gratification, right? And not understanding that those types of things really set us back from building the generational wealth that we see, you know, many of our white counterparts who had the head start, if you will, you know, to get those assets and things like that. And I feel like, unfortunately, we fall victim to trying to keep up with the Joneses because we're just living in this mindset of scarcity. You know, so let's kind of break that down a little bit about what you mean and unpack what you mean by your inner child, you know, doing the shopping for you on Black Friday and what that actually means.
Yeah, it's that when we do not have awareness around what we do, kind of going back to the previous question, what is really driving our decisions is our inner child, right? And, it could be our ego. So people talk about it as the ego, or just like wounds, right? That we as adults need to tend to. And so, sure, to your point, when you grow up with not very much and you see around you that the way ahead is to keep up, is to look a certain way. Sure. Again, people are just rewarded with attention, with money, with fame, by having these things. And you are, again, this stuff is just out of your awareness. Then you just blindly go. I like to talk about this as kind of being in a trance, right? And I think that most of us are in a trance before something typically happens that jolts us out of that. And we think, oh, wait, why am I doing this? Right. That's not me. That's what I saw fulanita or like mommy do, but that's not me. Let me really think about what my preferences are. Sure. And so it's really kind of getting out of that trance and awakening and developing that awareness that really gets us closest to our highest self, right? Like our true selves. Right.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, being able to bring in the inner child into it when you talk about that, because you're talking about kind of which I never really even pieced that together before even reading what you said, but like you're talking about wanting that attention, right? That love, that adoration, like all these things that kids search for, right? And then as adults, we're just finding ways to recreate, trying to get that feeling in our lives. Most of us just completely unaware about why we make the decisions that we do. And it's often, like you said, because we're kind of like we've starved our inner child so much as we've gone into adulthood almost.
Yeah. Yeah, and all our inner child wants is the adult version of us to tend to it, right? That's why it shows up in the shopping. That's why it shows up in the relationships. For sure, your inner child can literally be the person dating your partner if you're not aware. Yeah. It's because they have important information to tell you, and you just have to be awake and aware and choose to listen.
No, absolutely. I love that. Well, listen, Josie, it's been a pleasure getting to talk with you. I really appreciate you coming on the show. Where can people check you out? Where can they follow you, get more information about all that you're doing? Because you're producing some really amazing content for our community. So I want to make sure people check that out.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that feedback. I'm a really big fan of Instagram. So folks can check me out there at Josie Rosario NYC. My DMs are always open. So if folks have any questions, I'm always available to be a resource.
Amazing. Thank you again. It's been a pleasure talking with you. And I hope to get to have another conversation at some point soon.
Likewise.
Okay, great. Man, big shout out to my guest this week, Josie Rosario, for hopping on. I always love having somebody who tackles like our just mental and the mind and health and mental health as a profession. I feel like they always have such incredible perspectives into how we should be seeing the world. So big shout out to her for hopping on there. Make sure you give her a follow on social media. She's producing some incredible content for our community. And now with that said, let's end on some positivity because God knows we need it. And we'll do that in the form of a positive quote. Now, this week's quote comes to us from one of my personal heroes, the late, great Nipsey Hussle. Rest in peace. This quote says, "Be truthful with yourself and other people and try your best to make decisions outside of your ego." And this is so incredibly important. I've personally been stewing on the idea of our ego as of late and all that it does to get in the way of us doing the things that are meant for us and that we genuinely want to do and get out of this life. Our ego causes us to try and keep up with the Joneses at the expense of putting ourselves years behind or not allowing us to build in the way that we should be. It allows us to not tap into being our authentic self because we are too concerned with what the outside world may think of us. And if you truly want to find your true potential in this life, you want to do great things, you want to be the best version of yourself, you have to have a reckoning with your ego and make sure that it is not leading you and that your authentic self is the one that is in fact behind the wheel, guiding you and allowing you to live the life that you have dreamed of. Just some food for thought. Now, with that said, thank y'all so much for tuning into another episode. I'll be back next week and we'll do it all over again. Until then, stay safe and I'll talk to y'all soon. Bye.